My mother-in-law called my boss on a Tuesday morning and told him I was embezzling from the company. By Friday, I was cleaning out my desk. By the following spring, she had lost her house, her savings account, her son's trust, and every friend she thought she had built over 30 years of careful social architecture. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the phone call I wasn't supposed to know about. Actually, let me back up even further, because none of this makes sense without understanding who Sandra Coletti is, and who she decided I was the moment her son brought me home for Thanksgiving 7 years ago. To understand the ending, you have to understand the beginning. And the beginning was a platter of homemade lasagna, a glass of Barolo, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, the smile I would spend the next 4 years trying to interpret as warmth, because the alternative was too exhausting to accept. My name is Mara Hendricks, now Mara Coletti, though there were times in the past year when I thought very seriously about going back to Hendricks, and not for the reason you might think. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, middle class, nothing fancy, nothing to be ashamed of. My dad, Phil, worked 32 years in logistics for a regional trucking company and retired with a good pension and a golf handicap that he talked about constantly. My mum, Diane, was a dental hygienist for 27 years at the same practice 2 miles from our house. A woman who could talk to anyone about anything and who knew every patient's family situation by name and birthday. We weren't the kind of family that vacationed in Tuscany or argued about which country club had the better golf course. We were the kind of family that played rummy on Friday nights and drove a Ford Explorer with a dent in the passenger door that nobody ever fixed because it was just a dent and the car drove fine. I never thought any of that would matter to anyone. That was my first mistake. I met Daniel Coletti the second semester of my second year of graduate school. He was finishing his MBA at the same university where I was getting my master's in communications, and we ended up at the same table at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. One of those casual, crowded dinners at a place with communal seating, where you end up talking to whoever's next to you out of necessity and politeness. He was funny. Not trying to be funny. Not the kind of guy who tells you jokes and waits for your reaction. Genuinely witty, in this dry, observational way that caught me off guard and then kept catching me off guard for the next 2 hours until we realized everyone else at the table had gotten their check and we were the last 2 people there. He texted me the next morning. We were basically inseparable within 2 weeks. Daniel came from money, not obscene money, not the kind that comes with a family name on a building somewhere, but comfortable, established, generational money of the kind that gives people a certain quality of ease that they often don't even recognize in themselves because they've never known anything different. His father, Raymond, had built a mid-sized commercial real estate firm from scratch in the early 80s, starting with a single strip mall in suburban New Jersey, and had sold the company for a very comfortable sum about 10 years before I came into the picture. Raymond, at the time I met Daniel, was retired, largely checked out from anything that required him to be indoors for more than a few hours at a stretch. A quiet man of few words who spent his days fishing, watching old westerns, and occasionally calling Daniel with unsolicited opinions about baseball teams. I liked Raymond. He was easy in the way that people are easy when they have nothing to prove. But Sandra was something else. Sandra Coletti had grown up in a good family and married into a better one, and had spent 30 years making absolutely certain that everyone around her understood the value of the life she'd built. She was on the board of 2 non-profits, was a fixture in the social calendar of their town, and had the kind of relentless, managed elegance that suggests a person who has devoted significant mental energy to the project of being impressive. She had a way of making you feel, when you were in the same room with her, that you were slightly underdressed and slightly underprepared, and that she was being extraordinarily gracious about it. I didn't figure that out right away. The first Thanksgiving was warm enough that I came home thinking I'd been worried for nothing. She hugged me when we walked in the door, showed me around the house like I was a welcome guest, poured me wine before I had the chance to ask for it, and spent 45 minutes asking me thoughtful questions about my graduate program with what seemed like genuine interest. She laughed at my jokes. She called me by my name, not Daniel's friend or the girlfriend. I remember sitting in the passenger seat on the drive home, the night dark and cold outside, and telling Daniel his mother was lovely and that I'd been anxious for no reason. He squeezed my hand over the center console and said he was glad. What I didn't know, what he told me 2 years later, after everything, was that earlier that same morning, before we'd arrived, Sandra had called Daniel into the kitchen while he was helping her set up the folding chairs, and asked him, very quietly, whether I was serious girlfriend material, or just a phase he was going through before he figured out what he actually wanted. He told her I was serious. She'd nodded in the way you nod when someone tells you something, and you're filing it away for later rather than accepting it. He told me that, and I thought about how I'd sat across from her at that table and felt so warm and welcomed. I thought about how good she was at that, at making you feel like the room was for you, when actually the room was always for her. It happened gradually, the shift. That's the thing about this kind of behavior. It's designed to be gradual, designed so that any single incident sounds trivial when you try to describe it to someone else. Oh, my mother-in-law said a weird thing at dinner. That's it. That's the whole story. It doesn't sound like anything, but it accumulates. It builds up in layers like sediment, each layer thin and unremarkable on its own. And then one day, you realize you're standing on 12 feet of it, and you can't even see the original ground. The comments came in the form of compliments that weren't. You're so brave to keep your hair that long. Most women thin out as they get older. It's impressive how you manage on your salary. Daniel always says you're very practical. Oh, I saw that neighborhood you two are looking at. It's perfectly nice for a starter situation. Each one had the grammatical shape of something kind. Each one had a stinger tucked inside. And each one was delivered with that smile, that wide, bright, perfectly maintained smile, so that if you ever said something about it, if you ever pushed back or mentioned it to anyone, you'd sound paranoid. You'd sound difficult. You'd sound like exactly the kind of woman who wasn't good enough for her son. Which was, of course, the whole point. Daniel heard some of it, not all of it. Sandra was careful about what she said in front of him versus when he was out of earshot. But enough. He'd get a look that I came to think of as his troubled look, this slight furrow between his brows, and he'd say things like, "That's just how she talks," or "She doesn't mean it the way it sounds," or "She's warming up to you, she just takes time." I understood, genuinely understood that he loved his mother and that she was his mother, and that the things we overlook in the people we love are not evidence of stupidity, but of loyalty. I didn't want to fight about her. I didn't want to make him feel like he had to choose sides in some ongoing conflict that I couldn't even fully articulate. So I swallowed most of it. I learned to redirect conversations when they started going toward territory that made my jaw tight. I learned to excuse myself to the bathroom when I felt the color rising in my face. I learned to smile through dinner and cry quietly in the passenger seat on the way home, turn toward the window so Daniel wouldn't see. Then Daniel proposed, and everything got worse. He did it right, I'll say that. He did it exactly right. A Saturday morning in late April, the kind of spring morning that makes you feel like the city has been washed clean overnight, and he took me to this park 2 blocks from our apartment, where the Japanese cherry trees were in full bloom, this avenue of pink and white blossom that was almost embarrassingly beautiful. And he got down on one knee on the little stone bridge over the koi pond. The ring was his paternal grandmother's, a simple platinum band with a single round diamond, not flashy, not showy, perfect. I cried before he even finished the sentence. He cried, which surprised me, because Daniel is not usually a crier. A woman walking a golden retriever stopped on the other side of the pond and started clapping. It was the kind of moment that people say is perfect, and usually it's hyperbole, but in this case it was simply accurate. And then we called his parents. Raymond answered first. He whooped, actually whooped, which I'd never heard Raymond do in any context, and then passed the phone to Sandra. And I watched Daniel's face across the table, where we were now sitting with champagne, watched it go from lit up and bright to careful, and then, gradually, to flat in a way that made something in my stomach go cold, even though I couldn't hear what she was saying. He kept saying, "Yes, Mom," and "I know, Mom," and "We'll talk about it, okay?" And when he hung up, he set the phone down on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at me. "She wants to have lunch," he said. "Just her and me." They had lunch the following Tuesday. He came home from it looking the way he looked after difficult client meetings, drained in a specific, managed way, the kind of drained you get when you've been professional for hours through something you didn't want to be professional about. He told me she had concerns. He didn't tell me all of them, not that night, and I didn't push as hard as I probably should have, because I was still holding the champagne feeling from the proposal, and I didn't want to contaminate it. But I gathered enough. She thought we were moving too fast. She thought I didn't have an established enough trajectory. She thought, and this came out only after I asked him directly, looking at him across our kitchen table with a glass of wine in my hand, that he could do better. That was the first time I saw Daniel push back at her in any real way. He told her he loved me. He told her he was certain about me. He told her the wedding was going to happen. She apparently cried, which he still felt terrible about even while telling me about it. And that told me everything about the position he'd been in his whole life with this woman. That her tears was something he experienced as his responsibility. That her feelings were a problem he was supposed to solve. I told myself it would get better once we were actually married. People come around. Families adjust. I had read the articles and heard the stories and believed, with the kind of belief that is really just hope, dressed up in more confident clothes, that the permanence of the marriage would change things. We got married on a Saturday in September, 2 years after the proposal, because we wanted time to do it right, and also because finding a venue that could accommodate 140 guests without costing the gross domestic product of a small country took longer than expected. It was a beautiful wedding, not extravagant, but warm and personal and very us. A venue with exposed brick walls and warm Edison bulb lighting that made everyone look good. A live band that played Motown and classic soul. A dinner menu that Daniel and I had worked on for 6 months and argued about lovingly and constantly, ultimately including both the salmon I wanted and the short ribs he wanted. The salmon was excellent. So were the short ribs. So was everything. Sandra sat at the family table in a champagne-colored lace dress that was technically not white, but was close enough to white that she knew exactly what she was doing. And she was magnificent. She danced with Raymond during the first slow song. She cried during the vows in a way that photographed beautifully. She held my hands during the reception and told me I looked stunning. She gave a little impromptu toast at the dinner table that made people laugh and tear up at the same time, all about how much she loved her son and how she couldn't imagine a better woman at his side. Not one thing she said that night was untrue, technically. She did love her son. She was not imagining a better woman. She was actively working toward it. But she wasn't imagining it. The toast was a technically accurate document that created a completely false impression. I would come to understand that this was Sandra's essential skill. None of the wedding photos captured what she said to my maid of honor, Priya, in the bridal suite bathroom, about 40 minutes before the ceremony started. Priya didn't tell me until 8 months later. She'd decided not to tell me on the wedding day because it was my wedding day, and then not on the honeymoon because it was our honeymoon, and then not in the first months of marriage because we were happy and new, and she didn't want to introduce something ugly into something good. By the time she told me, we were at Sunday brunch, and she just put down her mimosa mid-sentence, looked at me, and said, "I've been holding something for too long, and I need to tell you." She'd been in the bathroom touching up her lipstick, she said. Sandra had come in. Not just wandered in, come in deliberately, waited until it was just the two of them, and then looked at Priya in the mirror with that particular Sandra expression that is not quite a smile, and said, very quietly, "You're her best friend. You should talk some sense into her. Daniel deserves someone who can give him a real life." Then she adjusted her fascinator and walked out. Priya said she'd stood there with her lipstick wand in her hand while the door swung shut, too stunned to respond. She'd kept thinking about what she should have said and hadn't said for the rest of the night, and then for the next 8 months. I sat with that for a while. What I felt wasn't surprise exactly, because by the time Priya told me, I had 4 years of context for who Sandra was. What I felt was something more like crystallization. All the small, separate incidents of the past 4 years suddenly coming together into a single, coherent shape. This is who she is. Not a difficult person with rough edges. Not a loving mother who doesn't know how to show it. A person who had looked at my best friend in a bathroom mirror on my wedding day and tried to dismantle my marriage before it had started. I filed it away. I didn't bring it up with Daniel right away because I was thinking carefully about what I actually wanted to do with it, and because part of me was afraid that if I brought it up too directly, it would create a confrontation that neither Daniel nor I was ready to have. We were happy. We had a good marriage, a genuinely good one, the kind where you still like each other after a hard week, where you can be boring together without it feeling like settling, where the small irritations of living with another person are outweighed by the specific comfort of their presence. I didn't want to damage that with a war that had no clean ending. So I kept going to Sunday dinners. I kept smiling at Sandra across her mahogany table. I kept accepting the compliments that weren't compliments. And she kept making her little cuts, and I kept absorbing them. And everything was fine, in the way that things are fine when the pressure underneath is steadily building, and you're choosing not to look at the gauge. My job during all of this was at a marketing and communications firm called Brightwell Partners, where I'd been for about 4.5 years by the time Daniel and I got married. I managed client accounts, mostly mid-sized tech companies and a few healthcare brands, and I had worked my way up from junior account manager to senior account manager in about 3.5 years, which was faster than most people made that jump. My boss, Craig Elkins, was a straight talker who told me at my last annual review that I was being considered for the partner track, and that if the next 18 months went as the previous 3 years had gone, the conversation would be very straightforward. I liked Craig. I liked my work. I was proud of what I'd built there. It had taken real effort, late nights, difficult clients, the specific kind of grinding patience that good account management requires. And I was proud of it, in the specific way you're proud of something you've actually earned. Sandra, for her part, seemed barely aware that I had a job in any meaningful sense. She referred to it in the tone of voice people use for hobbies. Vaguely impressed, slightly bemused, always with the underlying implication that it was something I was doing to occupy myself until the real chapter of my life began. The real chapter being, in Sandra's view, the chapter that involved producing grandchildren and reducing my work schedule to something more manageable, and generally centering my existence more fully around Daniel's comfort and her access to him. This was not something she said directly. It was something she communicated in approximately 400 separate small ways over 4 years, which is actually a more efficient method of delivery because it leaves no single quotable sentence for the other person to push back against. What I didn't know in those 4 years of Sunday dinners and loaded compliments and swallowed words was that Sandra had started doing her homework. I found out later, through the discovery process, that it had begun about 8 months before she made the call. 8 months during which she had been, quietly and methodically, building something. She had a contact, not a close contact, not a friend, but someone who'd done vendor work for Brightwell Partners and who still had access to certain internal communication channels, the kind of access that should have been revoked when the vendor contract ended, but wasn't because nobody had gotten around to it. Sandra had been asking this contact pointed questions about billing practices, about client accounts, about my name specifically attached to specific account codes. She wasn't fishing randomly. She knew what she was looking for. Or rather, she knew what she wanted to find, which is a different thing. and she was looking until she found something she could shape into it. The documents she eventually got were internal billing reports, combined with a single invoice that had been formatted in a non-standard way for reasons that were completely mundane and would be obvious to anyone in the industry for about 30 seconds. Sandra had presented these documents to her attorney, who had written a cover letter framing them as evidence of discrepancies in my billing practices and suggesting that the company might want to investigate whether funds were being mishandled. The attorney had sent this package to Brightwell Partners' HR department, and the HR department had taken it up with Craig Elkins. And Craig Elkins had spent a very uncomfortable Monday afternoon with his own legal counsel trying to figure out what he was obligated to do. What he was obligated to do, it turned out, was put me on administrative leave while the investigation was conducted. He pulled me into his office on a Tuesday morning with a look on his face I'd never seen in 4.5 years of working for him. He closed the door. He asked me to sit down. He put his hands flat on the desk in the way that people do when they are bracing themselves for something they don't want to say. "Mara," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I told him, of course. "I received a communication last week," he said carefully, "from a woman who identified herself as a close family connection. She submitted materials alleging that you've been overbilling clients and retaining the difference." The words went through me in a way that wasn't quite comprehension, not at first. My brain kept trying to route them towards something that made sense and kept failing. "She submitted documentation," he continued. "She made specific claims about specific accounts. HR has already been in contact with our legal team, and I have been advised that we need to." "Craig." My own voice sounded strange to me, flat and very controlled. "Who contacted you?" He hesitated. "I need to know who contacted you." He looked at me. "She gave her name as Sandra Coletti." The room didn't spin. Nothing dramatic happened. I sat very still, and I heard the air conditioning unit cycling on, and someone's phone ringing 2 offices down the hall, and my own heartbeat, which had relocated from my chest to directly behind my eyes. "She's my mother-in-law," I said. Craig's face did something complicated. Several things at once, actually, which I think was a collision of professional obligation and human reaction happening simultaneously. "I understand that," he said. "And I want to be clear that I have significant doubts about the credibility of these claims. You have been exemplary in this role. But I am in a position where HR has already been looped in, and there's a formal submission from an attorney, and I cannot." "You have to investigate," I said. "I have to investigate," he said. He looked like he hated himself for it. "How long?" I asked. 2 to 4 weeks, he said. "And I need to put you on administrative leave during the investigation. I'm sorry, Mara. I am genuinely sorry. I want you to know that this is not, that I don't—" "I know," I said. I stood up. I was very calm. The calm was the other side of shock, the place your nervous system goes when it gives up trying to process the input in real time. I walked back to my desk. I put my phone charger in my bag. I put the small succulent I'd had on my desk for 2 years in my bag. I put the framed photo of Daniel and me from our honeymoon in my bag. I cleared my computer screen. I said goodbye to my assistant Maya, who looked confused and worried, and whom I didn't explain anything to because I couldn't yet explain anything to anyone, including myself. I walked out of Brightwell Partners on a Tuesday morning at 10:47 with a bag over my shoulder and everything that mattered on my desk packed into it. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard. I think I was waiting for the shock to become something else, something more workable, but it didn't. It just sat there, heavy and specific. Then I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring, which meant he wasn't in a meeting. I told him what had happened. I told him his mother had called my boss and accused me of stealing from my clients. I told him she'd submitted documents through a lawyer. I told him I was on administrative leave, sitting in the parking garage, having just packed up my desk. Silence. Mara, he said. Daniel, are you sure it was... Craig told you. He said her name, I said. Sandra Coletti. That is not a name that belongs to anyone else in my life. More silence. Then, I'm leaving right now. He was home in 15 minutes, which meant he must have basically run to his car. He came through the door looking like he'd been physically struck. That slightly dazed quality of someone whose world has just reorganized itself without warning. I was at the kitchen table with a glass of water I'd poured and not touched. He sat down across from me. We looked at each other for a moment. I'm calling her, he said. Okay, I said. He called from the kitchen while I sat at the table and listened to his end of it. She answered on the third ring. He said her name. He asked, straight out, whether she had contacted Brightwell Partners. There was a pause, during which I couldn't hear what she said. Then Daniel said, quietly, Mom. Another pause, then, what were you thinking? It wasn't a question. He was on the phone for 22 minutes. By the end, his voice had gone to a place I'd only heard once before. The night his father had had the cardiac event 3 years ago. Flat and careful and extremely controlled in the way that people get when they are containing something that could be very large if they let it out. He hung up and sat back down across from me. She says she has proof, he said. I looked at him. She says she has documentation showing discrepancies. She says she felt she had no choice but to bring it to the company's attention. She doesn't have proof, I said. There's nothing to have proof of. I have never touched a client's money, not once, not in 4.5 years. I know that, he said immediately. Then what is she saying she has? He rubbed his face with both hands and then left them there for a moment, covering his eyes. When he put them down, he looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the time of day. She found some documents. She won't tell me exactly how. She says they show irregularities in billing. She fabricated something, I said slowly. Or she found something she doesn't understand and decided it meant what she wanted it to mean. I don't know what she did. I do, I said. Daniel, I don't know the mechanics of how she did it, but I know why she did it. This isn't about documents. She doesn't care about Brightwell's billing practices. She is trying to get me out of your life and this was the method she chose this time. He didn't say anything to that. He didn't argue with it, which told me he'd already gotten there himself. "Are you okay?" he asked. I thought about it. "No," I said. "Not right now." He reached across the table and took my hand and held it. We sat there in our kitchen in the middle of a Tuesday morning, two people on the wrong side of something that had just been done to us, and we didn't talk for a while. Sometimes the most important thing two people can do is just sit with something together. The investigation took 3 weeks and 4 days. I know this because I counted. I know the exact number of days because I was at home for all of them, unable to access my work email, unable to contact my clients, watching my accounts be handled by colleagues who knew the work but didn't know the relationships, and waking up every morning with a low, dense anxiety sitting in my stomach that didn't lift until I was busy enough to stop noticing it, and sometimes not even then. Daniel was angry in a way that he didn't entirely know what to do with. He'd grown up in a family where Sandra's behavior was managed through avoidance and accommodation, where her excesses were explained and smoothed over, and never directly confronted, because confronting Sandra meant dealing with Sandra, and dealing with Sandra in a direct way was exhausting and usually unproductive. He'd never had to figure out how to be angry at her, because he'd never let himself fully see what was worth being angry about. Now he was seeing it all at once, and it was a lot. He called her twice more during those 3 weeks. The conversations were short. She maintained, apparently, that she had acted out of genuine concern, that she had information that warranted action, that she was sorry if it was causing disruption, but she had felt she had no choice. This framing, "I had no choice," was interesting, because it was both a denial of agency and a claim of virtue simultaneously, the rhetorical equivalent of, "I don't want to do this, but I have to," which is a sentence that is usually untrue. I spent the 3 weeks preparing. I'm not sure when exactly the shift happened, when I went from shell-shocked to strategic. I think it was around day 6 or 7, somewhere in the middle of that first week, when I woke up in the middle of the night and lay there in the dark and realized that I had a choice. I could spend these weeks being a victim of something that had been done to me, which was an accurate description of my situation and the completely reasonable response. Or I could spend these weeks making sure that what had been done to me was never going to be done again. I chose the second thing. The first call I made was to a lawyer. Gwen Tattersall had been recommended by a colleague who'd gone through a difficult business dispute 2 years earlier, and when I called her and explained the situation, her response was calm and precise in a way that immediately made me feel like I was talking to the right person. She told me that what Sandra had done potentially constituted tortious interference with employment, defamation, and possibly civil fraud, depending on how the documents she'd submitted had been obtained. She told me we'd want to build a paper trail, document everything, and wait until the investigation concluded before making any formal moves, because the outcome of the investigation would affect what claims we could make and how credibly we could make them. She told me to keep notes. She told me to save everything. She told me she'd be ready to move the moment we got the all clear. The second call I made was to Priya. I told her everything. The call to Craig, the documents, the administrative leave, all of it. She was silent for a long moment after I finished, and then she said, very quietly, in a voice I'd never quite heard from her before. "What do you need me to do?" "Just be in my corner," I said. "Obviously," she said, "but I mean specifically. What can I actually do?" I told her I'd let her know. What I already knew, even on day 7, was that Priya was going to be part of this. She had the story from the bridal suite. She had 4 years of witnessed incidents that I'd described to her over brunches and phone calls and evening glasses of wine. She was, in the language of legal proceedings, a witness. I just didn't know yet what she was going to witness. I also thought about Bonnie Marsh. I'd known about Bonnie for years. Sandra talked about her constantly, in the fond but proprietary way that people talk about their oldest friends, as if ownership of the friendship confers a kind of status. Bonnie and Sandra had been friends since their kids were in elementary school. They had lunch every Wednesday without fail. They traveled together twice a year. They knew everything about each other in the way that 30 years of close friendship produces. But I'd also noticed, at family gatherings over the years, that Bonnie looked at Sandra sometimes with an expression that wasn't quite what you'd expect from a fully devoted best friend. It was an expression that I'd mentally described to myself as clear-eyed. Not critical, not disappointed, but aware. Bonnie knew who Sandra was, I suspected. She'd had 30 years to figure it out. I asked Daniel if he thought Bonnie and I could talk, privately. He looked at me steadily. "What are you thinking?" "I'm not thinking anything yet," I said, which was not entirely true. "I just think she might be a useful person to have a conversation with." "She's Sandra's best friend," he said. "I know," I said. He thought about it. "Do what you think is right," he said. "I trust you." Gwen sent Oni a request on my behalf. Formal, but not aggressive. Just asking for a conversation. Bonnie called me directly 3 days later. "We met at a coffee shop on a Thursday morning. A neutral place, nothing loaded about it." She was in her early 60s, trim and well-dressed in the understated way that Sandra's crowd tended to be, with a directness in her manner that I hadn't quite expected. I brought the summary Gwen had put together and I laid it out for Bonnie plainly. What Sandra had done, the timeline, the nature of the documents, the attorney submission, the 3 weeks of administrative leave. I was factual. I was not emotional. I let the events speak for themselves. Bonnie stirred her coffee the whole time I was talking. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know about this." I said I believed her. "She told me she was worried about you," Bonnie said. "She didn't tell me she'd done anything." She paused. "That's how she does things. She tells you just enough." I waited. "She's done things before," Bonnie said carefully. "When Raymond and she were having problems years ago, she stopped herself. "I'm not going to go into things that aren't mine to share. I'll just tell you that Sandra has a pattern. She decides she's protecting someone, and then the protection becomes the most important thing, more important than whether it's actually what the person needs or whether it causes harm to someone else." She looked at me directly. "This is the furthest she's taken it." "Yes," I said. "What do you need from me?" Bonnie asked. I told her. I wasn't asking her to betray her friend. I wasn't asking her to testify or come forward or put herself in any kind of difficult position. I was asking her to not run cover. When this became public, and I told her I intended to make it public if Sandra did not make it right, I was asking Bonnie to let the truth stand on its own instead of defending Sandra out of loyalty. Bonnie looked at me for a long moment. "And if she does make it right?" Bonnie asked. "Then we find a way forward," I said. "I'm not trying to burn everything down. I'm trying to make sure she understands that there are consequences." "She doesn't believe in consequences," Bonnie said. "Not for herself." "She will," I said. Bonnie was quiet for a moment more. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said. "Okay, Mara." The call from Craig came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks and 4 days after I'd packed up my desk. I was in the spare bedroom we used as a home office, sitting at my laptop, not doing anything in particular, when my phone rang and I saw his name and felt my whole body go still. "Mara," he said, "the investigation is complete." I waited. Our forensic accounting team went through 26 months of your billing records. We found no evidence of any irregularity of any kind. The documents submitted by, a brief pause, the outside party were found to be either taken significantly out of context or, in one case, to reference a billing format that is entirely standard practice for the type of account it was associated with. I exhaled very slowly. "You are completely cleared," Craig said, "with absolutely no reservations. I would like you back on Monday morning, and I would like to sit down with you and discuss in concrete terms what we can do to make this right. I also want to be transparent with you about the fact that our legal team is now very interested in the source of those documents, because the method by which they were obtained may represent a separate issue for us to address." "Thank you, Craig," I said. "Mara," his voice shifted slightly. "I'm sorry. Truly. You deserved better than this." I hung up and sat very still at my desk and looked at the wall in front of me for probably 3 minutes. And then something settled in me. Not relief exactly, though there was some of that. Something quieter and more purposeful. Something that said, "Now." I had been patient for 4 years. I had smiled and redirected and given benefit of the doubt and treated the situation as something manageable, something that time and grace could improve. I had been wrong. Sandra had spent 8 months methodically building a case against me. 8 months. While sitting at Sunday dinners with me and air-kissing my cheek at holiday parties and telling me my dress was a beautiful color. 8 months of phone calls and contacts and targeted questions and fabricated documentation. She had tried, with actual premeditation, to destroy my career. I called Gwen. I told her the investigation had cleared me completely. I asked her when we could file. "Monday?" she said. "Monday," I said. The confrontation happened before the filing. I had decided, after talking it through with Gwen and with Daniel and with Priya over approximately 10 days of conversation, that Sandra deserved the chance to fix it before the legal machinery started moving. Not because I owed her that chance, I didn't, but because I wanted to look her in the eye and offer her a specific, concrete path to accountability, so that when she didn't take it, I would know with complete certainty that I'd given her the option. The timing of the confrontation was deliberate. The last Sunday of April was Raymond and Sandra's 40th anniversary party, an event they'd been planning for months, a dinner at a private room at their favorite restaurant, about 40 guests, a mix of family and close friends, and a few of Raymond's old business contacts. Daniel and I had helped plan it. We'd picked the venue. We'd contributed to the gift. We were in the program. Daniel had offered to cancel. I'd said no. I wanted to do this in front of people, not to perform humiliation, but because Sandra's entire operational model was built on the distinction between what happened in private and what was witnessed. She had spent 4 years making small cuts in private while maintaining her performance in public. She had tried to destroy my career through a series of private communications. I wanted to have this conversation somewhere where there were eyes. We arrived early. Daniel was tense in the steady, controlled way he'd been getting better at over the past several weeks. Tense, but not rattled. Present, but not reactive. He had done his own internal work about his mother during this period, his own reckoning with who she was and what he was and wasn't willing to accept going forward. He hadn't cut her off. He hadn't asked me to dictate his relationship with her, but something had shifted in him, some fundamental reorientation, and I could feel it in the way he stood next to me that evening, beside me in a way that was different from how he'd stood beside me at other family events, more deliberate. Raymond met us at the door in a good suit, pink-faced with happiness, a little emotional in the way he got on milestone occasions. He hugged Daniel, shook my hand, and then seemed to decide that was insufficient and hugged me too, which was unusual for Raymond. Sandra came out from the direction of the kitchen in a deep midnight blue dress with pearl earrings and that same full-teeth smile, and she air-kissed us both and said all the right things and poured us into the room with the ease of someone who has been managing social gatherings for 30 years. I let the evening run for about 40 minutes. Drinks were poured. Guests arrived. The room reached a comfortable level of warm noise. Conversations overlapping, glasses clinking, the smell of good food starting to come through from the kitchen. Bonnie arrived about 20 minutes in and met my eyes when she came through the door and gave me a small, composed nod. When I felt the room had settled into its own momentum, I found Sandra standing near the bar, talking to one of Raymond's old colleagues, and I waited for a natural pause in the conversation, and then I said, "Sandra, could I speak with you for just a moment?" She smiled at me. "Of course, sweetheart." We stepped into an alcove near the entrance to the private room, close enough to the gathering that we weren't invisible, far enough that we weren't in the centre of it. I had chosen the spot in advance. "I need to talk to you about what you did," I said. Her expression settled into something neutral and alert, the face of a person who has decided not to react until they know what they're reacting to. "I'm not sure what you mean." "You called Craig Elkins," I said. "You submitted documents through an attorney. You accused me of stealing from my clients. I was on administrative leave for 3 weeks. The investigation found nothing because there is nothing, because what you submitted was either fabricated or misrepresented. And I think you knew that. I was acting on information I believed to be credible, she said. Her voice was completely steady. I was concerned about my son's. How did you get the documents? I said. A pause. Small, but there. I have contacts, she said. Your contact pulled internal files they weren't authorized to access, I said. That's going to be a problem for them. It's already a problem for you. My attorney has reviewed everything, and what you did is tortious interference with employment, Sandra. It's defamation. Depending on how those files were obtained and how your attorney characterized them, it may be fraud. Her chin came up. You're threatening me at my anniversary party. I'm telling you the truth at your anniversary party, I said, because you left me no other venue. You need to lower your voice, she said. I'm not raising it, I said, which was accurate. I was extremely calm, the calmest I'd been in weeks. I want to tell you what I'm prepared to offer you, and then I want you to think about it carefully, because this offer is time limited. She waited. By next Friday, I said, I need a formal written retraction from you, delivered to Craig Elkins directly and copied to my attorney, retracting every claim you made. I need you to provide an explanation for how those documents were obtained, so that the people responsible for the unauthorized access can be held accountable. And I need a written acknowledgement to this family. I gestured, very slightly, toward the gathering behind us, that your conduct toward me has been inappropriate. Those are the terms. You're out of your mind, she said. If those terms are not met by Friday, I said, my attorney files Monday morning. Everything. The HR records, the attorney correspondence, the forensic accountant's findings, the discovery into how those documents were obtained will become part of a public proceeding. I have a contact at a publication that covers exactly this kind of story. I'm not interested in a scandal for its own sake. I'm interested in accountability. You can choose what that looks like. She stared at me. It was the first time in 4 years that I had her full, undivided attention without the performance layer on top of it. Underneath the smile, underneath the management, there was a woman who had just realized that the thing she'd been doing for years, the private damage, the public maintenance, the careful separation of what she did from what people saw, had finally produced a situation she couldn't manage her way out of. Daniel will never forgive you for this, she said. Daniel knows everything, I said. He's known for weeks. She looked past me. I didn't turn around, but I knew Daniel was there, because he was always somewhere I could find him that evening, and I knew he was watching. You have until Friday, I said, and I walked back into the party. Sandra did not respond by Friday. She didn't respond the week after either. I don't entirely know what she thought was going to happen. Maybe she thought I would back down when I saw she wasn't moving. Maybe she thought Daniel would mediate it into nothing. Maybe she simply could not believe, after years of operating in a world where her behavior had no visible consequences, that the consequences were real this time. Whatever she thought, she was wrong. Gwen filed on a Monday. The suit named Sandra on charges of defamation and tortious interference with employment. It sought compensation for my lost income during the administrative leave period, damages for the professional disruption and harm to my reputation, and attorney's fees. It also included a discovery request specifically targeting the documents Sandra had submitted and the method by which they'd been obtained, because that thread was something I very much wanted pulled. The thread, when pulled, was extensive. The discovery process took several months and produced information that even Gwen hadn't anticipated the scope of. The vendor who'd pulled the files, a woman named Carol Hendricks, no relation to me, which was a coincidence that was either very funny or very grim, depending on my mood, had indeed been doing contract work for a client that gave her access to certain internal Brightwell channels. Her contract had ended 8 months before the incident. Her access should have been revoked. It hadn't been. Sandra had cultivated a relationship with Carol over approximately 8 months, meeting with her twice, communicating via text regularly, and explicitly directing her to look for specific information related to specific accounts under my name. Carol had pulled files, compiled them into a document, and sent them to Sandra, who had then presented them to her attorney as documentation she had received. This was not a mother acting on impulse out of misguided love for her son. This was an 8-month premeditated operation. When that came out in discovery, the landscape of the case shifted considerably. Carol faced her own consequences. Brightwell pursued her separately for the unauthorized access, and she lost the consulting contracts she had with 2 other firms once the story became known in her professional circle. More significantly for my case, the premeditation established that Sandra's actions were not a moment of poor judgment, but a sustained campaign, which affected both the nature of the claims and the likely damages. Daniel stopped speaking to his mother for 2 weeks. Not at my request. I had not asked him to, would not have asked him to, because managing his relationship with his mother was not my job, and I'd been clear about that. He did it on his own, because 2 weeks into the discovery process, he called me from his car outside the office and said, 8 months, Mara. She was doing this for 8 months. And I said yes. And there was a silence. And then he said, I need some time. He took his time. Raymond called Daniel during that period, and Daniel told me about it afterward in general terms. That Raymond had apologized, that Raymond had said he hadn't known and should have seen more than he had, that Raymond was ashamed. I didn't know until later that Raymond had also told Sandra, directly, that what she had done was the worst thing he'd seen her do in 40 years, and that he needed her to fix it. Raymond came to our apartment on a Saturday afternoon. I was home alone. Daniel was running, which was the thing he did when he needed to think. Raymond knocked, and I let him in, and he sat down at our kitchen table and looked at his hands for a moment. I owe you an apology, he said. I started to say something about how it wasn't his fault. Let me finish, he said, gently. I saw things over the years, comments she made, the way she talked to you or about you. I told myself it was how she showed love. It was just her personality. People don't change at her age. I made excuses because it was easier than having the conversation. He paused. It wasn't easier for you. No, I said. I'm sorry, he said. I should have stepped in years ago. I believed him. I didn't perform gratitude. I just told him I appreciated it, because I did, and because Raymond had never been anyone who responded well to performances. He stayed for about 20 minutes and then left, and I sat at the kitchen table after he was gone and thought about how strange it is that the person you least expect to show up is sometimes the one who does. Sandra's first attorney withdrew in August. Her second attorney, the one she hired after the first one, quit, which tells you something about the first attorney's assessment of the situation, had a meeting with Sandra in which he laid out, apparently with considerable directness, what the likely outcome of going to trial would be. The damages, the discovery that would come out in open proceedings, the permanent public record. He strongly advised her to settle. Sandra called Daniel. She asked to meet with both of us. Daniel checked with me. I said yes. I had always been willing to have this conversation with her directly, if she was willing to have it honestly. We met at a restaurant. Nothing familiar to either of us. Neutral territory. She came in looking different than I'd ever seen her. Not smaller, exactly, but as if something that usually held her up was bearing less weight than usual. She sat down across from us. There was a moment of silence in which the ordinary sounds of the restaurant, other conversations, silverware, a busboy clearing a nearby table, felt very loud. I want to resolve this, she said. Okay, I said. I know what I did. She paused, and her jaw was tight in the way that things get when they're costing something. I know it was wrong, what I did to your job. I know that. I waited. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said. I know I don't have the right to ask for that. I want to settle this, and I want... Her voice went slightly rough for just a moment. I want my son back. Daniel makes his own choices, I said. He's not a term of settlement. I know, she said. The terms are what my attorney has put forward, I said. We can talk about everything else once those are met. But I need you to understand something first. I leaned forward slightly. I'm not doing this for the money. I need you to know that. I'm doing this because what you did needs to have happened on the record somewhere. You understand that? She was quiet for a moment. You spent 8 months building a case against me, I said. 8 months. While we were having Sunday dinners. While you were telling me my dress was a beautiful colour. You were doing this the whole time. Yes, she said, very quiet. Say it, I said. Daniel was absolutely still beside me. Sandra looked at me across the table, and I watched something move across her face. Not regret exactly, or not only regret. Something more complex and maybe more honest than that. I tried to take your job, she said. I planned it. I was wrong. The settlement was finalized in October. The terms included compensation for my lost income and professional disruption, full reimbursement of my legal fees, a formal written retraction submitted by Sandra's attorney to Brightwell Partners and to Craig Elkins personally, and a written acknowledgement, signed, dated, witnessed, addressed to Daniel, Raymond, and Anne, Sandra's sister, stating that her conduct toward me had been inappropriate, sustained, and wrong. The last term had been mine. Gwen had told me we didn't need it legally. I'd said I needed it anyway. I needed a piece of paper to exist in the world with Sandra's signature on it that said, I did this. Not because I needed it framed on a wall, but because 4 years of things done to me in private had earned the existence of one document done in public. She signed it. She delivered it to Daniel herself, handing him a sealed envelope at the lawyer's office where the settlement was completed. He took it and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket without opening it in front of her. He opened it later that evening, sitting at our kitchen table. I was there. He read it. He folded it carefully along the original creases. He put it in the manila folder where we were keeping all the documents from the past 6 months. He didn't say much. After a moment, he reached across the table and put his hand over mine. The aftermath did not arrive as a clean break. I want to be clear about that because the version of the story that gets tidied up for telling always implies a more defined before and after than actually exists. There was no moment when everything resolved. There was a gradual change in the weather, a slow shift in pressure, and then one day I realized it had been warm for a while. Daniel's relationship with Sandra rebuilt on different terms. He saw her at family events. He called on her birthday. He did not pretend that nothing had happened, and he did not go back to the dynamic that had always existed, the dynamic in which her feelings were the most important thing in the room, and his job was to manage them. He was civil. He was sometimes warm. He was his own person in a way that I think he'd always been trying to be and had never quite gotten permission for. And that was both a loss for him and a necessary thing. Craig Elkins promoted me to senior partner at Brightwell Partners 5 months after I came back from administrative leave. He told me at the meeting where he made it official that the way I had handled the entire situation, maintaining my professionalism throughout, engaging with the legal process cleanly, not making the firm feel implicated in what was ultimately a personal conflict, had demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and character he wanted in a partner. I said thank you. I did not tell him that I'd been terrified for most of it. That is information for friends, not professional relationships. Craig also told me, more quietly, that the firm had reviewed its third-party vendor access protocols after the situation with Carol and had implemented new offboarding procedures that would prevent that particular vulnerability from existing again. Something good came out of something bad, he said. I said that was usually how it went. Priya was my best friend through all of this, and she remains my best friend. And I don't have adequate language for what it means to have someone who shows up every time without being asked, who held things for me when I couldn't hold them myself, who never once said the wrong thing in a situation where there were many wrong things to say. She knows this. I've told her. She tells me to stop being sentimental and then hugs me for too long, which is exactly the right response. Bonnie Marsh called me in December, 4 months after the settlement. She said she'd been thinking a lot about things and she wanted me to know that she and Sandra were still friends, but that things between them were different now. She'd said some things to Sandra that needed saying, and Sandra had heard some of them and not others, which was probably about what Bonnie expected. She said she thought I was remarkable, and she was sorry she hadn't done more sooner. We've had lunch twice. It's an unusual friendship, arrived at through unusual circumstances, but it's real. Anne, Sandra's sister, who had called Daniel within days of the suit being filed to express her support, became someone I was actually glad to know. She's sharp and funny, and she has 30 years of context for who Sandra is, that produces a kind of dry, affectionate clarity that I find bracing. We text more than I expected to. Families are strange that way. You think you know what you're marrying into, and then it turns out to be larger and more various than you assumed. Sandra herself is living with something that doesn't have a neat name. She moves through the world in her good dresses and her pearls. She has her Wednesday lunches. She travels with Bonnie twice a year still, though I understand the trips are somewhat quieter than they used to be. She is not destroyed in any dramatic sense. She is simply someone who did something that is now documented, acknowledged, and known, and who has to carry that in the private space where the things we can't undo live. I don't hate her. I've thought about that a lot, whether I do, whether I should, whether the absence of hate is a form of generosity or just a form of distance. I think it's distance. What I have is clarity about who she is and what she is capable of, and that clarity has its own weight, but it's a weight I can work with. It doesn't drag, it just sits. We went back to the park in April. Daniel and I on a Saturday morning, exactly 2 years after the lawsuit was filed, on a morning that was grey-skied and unseasonably cool for late spring. The cherry trees were in bloom again. The same avenue, the same stone bridge over the same koi pond. The blossoms were out, pale pink against the grey, dropping in the wind in that extravagant way they do for the 2 weeks every year when they're at their most vulnerable and most beautiful. Daniel stood next to me on the bridge with his shoulder against mine, and we looked at the water and didn't say much for a while. "You okay?" he asked eventually. I thought about the question the way it deserved to be thought about. I thought about the 4 years of Sunday dinners with their small, managed cuts. I thought about the parking garage and the 11 minutes on the clock and the glass of water I'd poured and not touched. I thought about Gwen's calm precision and Priya's hand on mine, and Raymond's unexpected apology at our kitchen table, and Craig's voice on the phone saying, "Completely cleared," and the settlement folder in our filing cabinet, and the signed piece of paper that said, "I did this," and the way Daniel had taken it and put it in his jacket pocket without a word. I thought about the blossoms, about how they fall the same way every year, whether you're watching or not, about how the ground under this bridge had been here the whole time, solid, not moving, regardless of what we'd built our lives on top of. "Yeah," I said, "I really am." He put his arm around me. The blossoms came down around us. And I stood there on that bridge, with my promotion and my best friend and my husband who had chosen, when it mattered, to stand on the right side. And I felt exactly what it feels like when the ground beneath you is actually real.